400 kilometers above Earth, floating in the vacuum of space, an astronaut began to drown. Not in water from outside his suit, in water that had nowhere else to go but his own eyes, nose and mouth, sealed inside a helmet he couldn't remove. So how does a routine spacewalk turn into one of the closest calls in the history of the International Space Station? And why did it take NASA nearly a decade to fully explain what almost killed him? July 16, 2013. Italian astronaut Luca Parmitano and NASA astronaut Chris Cassidy stepped outside the International Space Station for what was supposed to be a 6.5-hour spacewalk. Routine maintenance, cable work, nothing exotic. It was Parmitano's second EVA and the first ever performed by an Italian. About 44 minutes in, something odd happened. A carbon dioxide sensor in Parmitano's suit briefly failed. Minor, resolved quickly. Then, moments later, he reported something stranger. Water on the back of his head, inside the helmet. Too much to just be sweat. Here's the part worth sitting with. 1 week earlier, during a different spacewalk, Parmitano had returned to the airlock to discover roughly half a liter of water already inside his helmet. At the time, the team concluded it had leaked from his in-suit drink bag, an assumption, not a confirmed diagnosis. That explanation was accepted, logged, and effectively closed. It was not treated as a reason to ground the next spacewalk. Now that same water was back, and this time his drink bag was already empty and dry. Mission Control and the astronauts began working through the possibilities in real time. A coolant leak, a plumbing failure, anything that could explain water where there shouldn't be any. Parmitano reduced his suit's cooling flow rate as a precaution, but the water didn't stop. It grew, and it started to move. In zero gravity, water doesn't behave the way it does on Earth. It doesn't pool at the bottom of a helmet and stay there. It clings in wobbling spheres, drifting wherever airflow and momentum carry it. And what was carrying this water was air moving toward Parmitano's face. Within minutes, it reached his eyes, then his nose, then his mouth. He could no longer see clearly. He could no longer hear his crewmate or mission control. The growing layer of water had begun interfering with his headset. He was, for practical purposes, isolated, blind, partially deaf, and breathing through a film of water inside a sealed helmet, 400 kilometers from the nearest doctor. Flight director David Court made the call to terminate the spacewalk immediately. Cassidy and Parmitano began making their way back to the airlock. But Parmitano couldn't see the handrails, couldn't hear directions, and had no way to simply pull off his helmet in the vacuum of space. He navigated by memory alone, tracing the route back along the station's exterior, essentially blind, feeling his way, hand over hand toward the hatch. Cassidy reached the airlock first and helped guide the process from there. The hatch was sealed. The airlock began repressurizing. And still, Parmitano had to wait, sealed inside a helmet with water rising around his face. Through the minutes it physically takes to bring a chamber back to breathable pressure. It was, by NASA's own later description, a condition in which a crew member was exposed to potential loss of life. When the inner hatch finally opened and the helmet came off, towels were used to sop up what remained. The final count, somewhere between 1 and 1.5 liters of water had accumulated inside. Enough that Parmitano, still calm, later admitted he'd considered drinking some of it just to clear his vision, and noted it tasted strange, likely tainted by anti-fog compound from the visor. The investigation that followed took over 6 months, and what it found was more troubling than a simple equipment failure. The root mechanical cause was a clogged filter inside the suit's fan pump separator, a component meant to keep water and air properly separated and routed. Contamination had blocked small holes inside it, and instead of being pushed away as designed, water backed up into the suit's breathing air loop and traveled toward the helmet. On Earth, gravity would have caused that same contamination to simply stall the fan, stopping the problem before it started. In zero gravity, the water instead clung to the housing, worked its way around the blockage, and kept climbing. But the mechanical fault wasn't the finding that made headlines. The investigation board was far more critical of what happened or didn't happen. After the first, smaller leak the week before, that earlier half-liter of water in Parmitano's helmet should have been a warning sign. Instead, it was diagnosed almost casually as a drink bag leak, logged and never escalated up the chain of command as a possible sign of a suit malfunction. The next spacewalk was approved anyway, and even after the full investigation, one piece of the puzzle was never fully closed. What actually contaminated that filter in the first place? NASA identified the mechanism of failure. It never definitively identified the source of the contamination that triggered it. What remains is a mishap that very nearly became a fatality. Not from an explosion, not from a hull breach, but from something as ordinary as water, behaving strangely in an environment the human body was never built for. It's worth sitting with how much of the outcome came down to Parmitano himself. Investigators later noted that his calm, methodical response, reducing cooling flow, communicating clearly for as long as he still could, navigating back by memory when every other sense failed him, likely saved his own life. A different reaction, a few more minutes of hesitation, and the story told here would not be about a close call. It would be about the first fatality of a spacewalk. Somewhere in that gap between diagnosed and understood, a warning sign was missed the week before it mattered most. For now, the only certainty is the one this incident leaves behind. In the vacuum of space, even water, the most basic substance there is, can become the thing standing between an astronaut and the next breath. If you want more of these, subscribe. What would you do in Parmitano's position, blind and running out of time in a sealed helmet? I'd genuinely like to hear it in the comments below.